I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
You know, a lot of people talk in big fancy words about climate change or the environment, and they just sort of assume there's nothing more to talk about. The world's either getting hotter or colder, the ice caps are melting. I wrote in a book, this was in 2009, that it's important to look at all angles of this issue and all the research, not just the research that says New York City will be underwater or the Earth's going to be 20 degrees hotter next year or whatever. So I really appreciated having Pulitzer Prize winner Elizabeth Kolbert on the podcast. She wrote the book, The Sixth Extinction, which she won the Pulitzer Prize for, which is about how man-made technology is changing the Earth in a lot of negative ways. But this new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, is all about the positive impact that a lot of man-made technology is having on saving species from going into extinction, or there's technologies for sucking carbon emissions out of the air. Like, there are all of these technologies and the people behind those technologies who are quickly developing ideas and are creative that could maybe help us in the current disasters that could happen. And regardless of what you believe or disbelieve, it's reality that a lot of species are going extinct and that we do want to have better uses of carbon emissions than just clogging up the atmosphere. So it's really worth paying attention to this stuff and listening to people like Elizabeth Kolbert, who is such an expert on this. So with that said, here's Elizabeth and me talking about extinction. Elizabeth, where are you based?
I'm sitting in the Berkshires in Western Mass.
Do you normally live in New York City, or is the Berkshires where you live?
I grew up outside New York City, but I live in the Berkshires and have for 25 years.
Hopefully the Berkshires will survive the next 50 years. That's probably one of the safer areas.
Well, in fact, do you know the Berkshires? Have you ever been to Williamstown?
No.
We have quite a nice art museum here, which is called the Clark Art Museum, which supposedly the site was chosen because the owner of the collection was afraid of nuclear war. So that's always made me feel some sense of comfort.
That fear exists around you creating the cultural events.
Well, no, that he chose Williamstown because he thought, well, in a case of a nuclear war, why would they bother to attack Williamstown? That was basically the idea.
Right. I always wonder about New York City, and I lived in New York City almost all my life, that it's the ideal place for anybody to attack for any reason at all. And
Yes.
yet so many people choose to live there, including myself. So,
Yeah, well, life is risk, as they say. So, yeah.
well, and this segues into your book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, and also your book, The Sixth Extinction, which won you a Pulitzer Prize. But essentially, humans, I think it's in our capacity to be mostly optimistic and to some extent, stupidly so. I mean, about a variety of issues, but what we're talking about today is climate change. And, do you think we're not really aware, or do you think we're being overly optimistic or overly pessimistic when it comes to the effects man-made climate change has on the world?
Well, I think one thing that's really not fully appreciated by the general public, though it's certainly very much a part of all, policy discussions about climate change, is that there's a big time lag in the system, that we've already basically guaranteed a lot of climate change that we haven't seen yet. And every day that we go on pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're guaranteeing more climate change. So I think that that's one of the issues here in terms of being optimistic or pessimistic. You could look at the climate today and say, well, we can adapt to this, we can deal with what's going on now. But what's really important to understand is that we have not yet seen the full effects of what we've already done. And we don't exactly know, I should also add, we don't exactly know what the full effects are going to be. These are subject to much, much study, much, much computing power, but there are error bars here. And so we're not sure exactly even if we stopped emitting CO2 tomorrow, what kind of a temperature increase we'd get out at the end.
Right. You mentioned in the book that carbon emissions are cumulative, so that when you stop emitting carbon emissions, it doesn't necessarily reduce the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. It just increases more slowly. And so to that extent, the effects we're having, which are mentioned in both The Sixth Extinction and in this brand new book, Under a White Sky, is these effects are ongoing. So Arctic caps are melting, rare fish are going extinct. Many species are going extinct, but you explore a lot of issues of different fish and so on in this book. You also discuss, is it possible to maybe suck carbon emissions out of the air?
Well, that's one of the, to use a sort of bad pun, it's a very, very hot issue right now. So
I think that's an excellent pun.
as you said, CO2 emissions are, for all intents and purposes, cumulative. And we've already put a lot of CO2 up there. We've increased, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since, pre-industrial times by almost, 50% at this point. And that's already had very dramatic effects. We really saw that this year, I think. The fires in California, the hurricane season, extraordinary hurricane season, some of those storms that really rapidly intensified as they went over the Gulf of Mexico, which was very warm. So we're seeing some pretty dramatic changes at the CO2 levels that we are at now.
And could those changes be explained statistically at all? And I just want to cover all the potential objections.
Absolutely.
Is it unusual to have this level of hurricanes, or to what extent were the fires, as claimed by some, caused by inappropriate forest management, or I don't know. And the fires in Australia were supposed to rage for the entire year, but they were mostly extinguished by March, fortunately. So I want to solve all the objections as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. And I think I will try to be conservative in what I'm saying. How's that? So, what we know about fires are that the fire season, so, there are a lot of studies on this, the fire season, what are called sort of fire days, where you would have the right conditions for fires in a place like California, have increased pretty dramatically. So, that's a combination of rising heat, also drought out in California. So I think that's a pretty robust phenomenon. Now, you are layering on top of that, as you say, some fire management practices that have fuel build up over the years by actually suppressing fires. Also, people just moving into places that they didn't used to live. So, it's not I don't want to claim there's one cause and it's climate change. But in terms of the fires in Australia and the fires in last winter, their summer, our winter in Australia, the fires this summer and fall in California, I think if you talk to experts, they would pretty much universally say there's definitely a fingerprint of climate change on those. Okay. Now, when we move to hurricanes, these are complicated predictions to make because there's some aspects of climate change that would make hurricanes more likely and some aspects that would make them less likely. So the sheer number of hurricanes we got this year was really high. It was almost a record-breaking year in terms of the number of named, storms there were. And we had to go into the Greek letters, something that we also had to do in 2005. So I don't think there's clear evidence at this point that we're getting more hurricanes. So certainly we have been getting a lot of them. But I think there's pretty clear evidence that hurricanes are getting stronger and also that they are intensifying more rapidly. So that means they start, they're coming over, in our case, in the US, the Gulf of Mexico, and they suddenly balloon from a Category 1 storm to a Category 4 storm within 24 hours. We saw that a couple of times this summer.
And you also mentioned that temperatures in the oceans are the highest they've been in possibly millions of years. And I'm just curious, how do we know what the temperatures were millions of years ago?
Well, I have to push back on that a little bit. I don't think I say that we know that temperatures in the oceans are the highest they've been in millions of years. Those are hard things to tease out. I think what I say is we know that carbon dioxide levels are the highest they've been in millions of years. How's that? Now, that's quite likely that temperatures are following suit. But as I say, there's also a lag time in the system, so we haven't gotten the full temperature increase yet. So the general sense is temperatures are or are about to be sort of at a level that they haven't been in maybe 3 million years since a period called the Pliocene, when life on Earth was pretty different. Before that was, I should also point out, long before what we call, anatomically modern humans even evolved. So as a species, we're only about 300,000 years old. So 3 million years is, 2.7 million years before we were even around.
Right. I guess the sapiens species, or the Homo genus, has been around 2 million years about, which maybe after this period. So given everything that's going on, and given that carbon emissions are cumulative in the atmosphere, and that we've already set in motion things that we can't necessarily pull back, given if we do nothing, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, there's many different roads to nothing. There's the road of we just say, la, 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 our emissions keep going up the way they have in recent decades, just soared, really. That's one road. And that's a really bad road that leads to temperature increases by the end of this century of a really ghastly 7 degrees Fahrenheit, let's say 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Just really kind of unimaginable temperature increases for the kind of world that we live in now, the world we're adapted to, the world that modern society is adapted to. Now, then there's we work really hard to bring down emissions, but we don't quite do it fast enough. We don't keep things under these thresholds that people have proposed, 2 degrees Celsius. So it's around 3.5 Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then we get a lot of very serious impacts. Once again, as I said, we're already seeing very serious impacts. We see very serious sea level rise. Some of our coastal cities are in trouble. We see people in parts of the world that are already very hot having more and more times when life is just almost on the verge of what humans can tolerate in terms of their heat tolerance. We see where you can plant different crops moving around. We see potential serious water shortages in parts of the world. Once again, thing we're already starting to see in some parts of the world. So that's a very different world, but perhaps one that we can negotiate our way through. Then there's the proposal, we're going to reach zero carbon emissions, very soon. And then we're also going to, and this gets back to your previous question, we're going to suck carbon out of the air. We're going to come up with some way to actually take some of the carbon that we've already put put up there and suck it out of the air. And that will also help to bring the climate back, once again, not right away because all of these things have a time lag associated with them, but eventually we will, sort of bring it back to the climate that you and I grew up with, or even a pre-industrial climate possibly. So these are all possibilities, and they're all very much on the table right now.
Right. So a 7-degree change, as you say, we're already starting to see heat levels where in some parts of the world are intolerable to the humans living there, or could be close to that. What's like a worst case scenario with 7 degrees? What else could happen? Are cities going to go underwater like Miami or New York or other coastal cities?
Well, once again, I'm not a climate scientist. I sometimes play one, on podcasts.
I'm relying on you to play one.
Yeah. Okay. I think, sea level rise is a function of two things. It's heating up your water, your oceans, and warm water expands. Warm water just takes up more volume than cold water. And then there is melting off the ices on land. So melting the Greenland ice sheet, melting mountain glaciers, melting Antarctica, all those things, heating up water and what's called the thermal expansion of water, that's pretty straightforward. But once you start to melt a really big ice sheet, it's unclear what the dynamics are, and it's unclear how long that takes. But certainly, I think this is a fairly uncontroversial statement. If you were to get to 2100, you were to have, basically a 7-degree temperature, average global temperature increase, you would have fated these ice sheets to melt. It would be very, very difficult to walk that back. And then you are looking at literally tens and possibly hundreds of feet of sea level rise. So certainly virtually all coastal cities at that point would be in big trouble. But, before you get to that point even, you get to potentially vast swaths of the world where, billions of people live being water stressed, water deprived. You get to really big parts of the world where, probably the staple crops can't grow anymore. So we would really be looking at a really radically transformed world where, billions of people would be on the move because where they lived just was really literally uninhabitable or just on the verge of survivable because of water stress and crop failure.
And as you mentioned, there's a lot more species extinction than the normal background extinction that has occurred throughout all of history. And just as there's been man-made manipulations to the environment that have potentially caused the problems that we're in, there's a lot of man-made manipulation now to try to save some of these species. And this is what you write about in Under a White Sky, which has just come out. How did you start exploring this? What made you interested in this to do it as a book, which is it's almost like a sequel to The Sixth Extinction. It's more extinctions and more man-made manipulation, but this time it's more positive man-made manipulation.
Well,
you're really into species dying.
A few years ago, I took a reporting trip to Hawaii, and I report on a project that became known as the Super Coral Project. And the idea behind that project, which was run by Ruth Gates, a scientist in Hawaii, and Madeline Van Oppen, a scientist in Australia, the idea was corals are these tiny little animals that build coral reefs, and they like warm water. They only live in warm water, in fact, but they're actually quite heat sensitive, and they don't like the fact that water temperatures are rising. So you're getting these events, which people have probably heard of, called coral bleaching events, when the corals turn white and basically die, and it's having a dreadful effect on reefs all around the world. And so the idea behind the Super Coral Project was, we've altered the oceans so much, they're warming up, corals don't like it. Can we find a way to basically goose up evolution, speed up evolution, get these corals to the point where they could survive a warmer ocean? If we just let them sit there, evolution's too slow, but maybe if we goose it along, we can get to that point. This whole project, it's a really fascinating project, and it really intrigued me. And it introduced this idea that we had manipulated the whole world. We'd changed the climate of the whole world. And now we were going to go and try to, manipulate the species that live in the world to ensure their survival. And I started to see that pattern out in the world wherever I went. And that was the inspiration for under a white sky? Is this sort of the next step in our long and very complicated relationship to the natural world?
Is there any danger that men don't really understand the interlocking effects of all the different species? You know, when one species dies, both the predators and the prey, their ecosystems change, and that has a ripple effect all throughout nature. Is it too much if we're kind of playing God to even save species?
Well, that's the question of our time to a certain extent. I mean, the question of whether we can, having unwittingly changed the planet in ways that we now find unfortunate, unpleasant, fatal to many species and, potentially many people. Can we now consciously come up with manipulations to counter that? And as you say, when you mess around or try to manipulate parts of really complicated systems, you can get some nasty surprises. So, some of the ecological messes that we're now trying to clean up, I tell the story in the book of the cane toad, which is a toad that was imported to Australia in the 1930s. It was supposed to eat beetle grubs that were plaguing Australia's sugar crop, but instead the toad, it was uninterested in, cane beetle grubs. It just ate everything in sight. It migrated all across the country. It's spreading even as we speak. It's taking more and more territory. It's a very poisonous toad. And Australia's wildlife has not evolved to avoid eating it. So many, many native Australian species have crashed because they consume these poisoned toads. So now people are trying to figure out very high-tech ways, including, genetic engineering, for how to either eliminate the toads or reduce their effects. And the question of whether we can make up for having made, one pretty bad boo-boo, which was introducing this toad into the landscape where it didn't belong, with another manipulation. These are questions that we're going to be and already are, confronting all the time, basically, as we move forward, because we have our thumb on the scale in basically every ecosystem in the world, in some cases knowingly, and in a lot of cases just, willy-nilly.
So what can we do? Is it a matter of coming up with hundreds of technological innovations to save different species, suck out carbon emissions and renewable energy like, fusion or solar energy or whatever powering our grid? Is that possible? Are we going to succeed at that? Or is it kind of hopeless given that we've already set in motion things that we can't take back?
Well, I don't have the answer to that question. One of the privileges, I guess, of being a journalist is, I went out, I reported this book. I wanted to draw attention to a pattern that I think, as I say, is already prevalent, where we try to come up with a new manipulation to counter the old manipulation. I think that is our future, basically. Whether it's going to work or not, though, I'll bounce that back to you. You are as qualified to say as I am whether that's going to work. When you put it that way, like, are we really going to, counter everything that we've done one manipulation at a time? It doesn't seem, wildly likely, but people are very smart and very ingenious, and we're all still here, despite having really very, very fundamentally tampered with a lot of the most basic biological and geochemical cycles on Earth, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, you name it, we've tampered with it. And I don't want to say that we're not going to be able to figure something out. And some of the manipulations I talk about in the book are very, very broad scale. They're not just going in and trying to save one species. They're really trying to potentially re-engineer the whole planet to make up for the ways that we have re-engineered the whole planet. So they're planetary scale interventions.
There's also, and you talk about this, there's also political solutions, but they're also tricky. Like some countries, like the United States, for instance, have created a lot of the carbon emissions that are currently in the atmosphere, and other countries, like many African or South American countries, have not. And as we start reducing or eliminating emissions, we're asking all of these countries to participate in these solutions, even if they're still developing countries and they need to get their economies going and carbon emissions are critical to that. How do we solve that issue, or how do we look at that issue?
Well, I mean, that's a huge one, I think. And I think the thinking goes, the most optimistic scenario goes, we as the US, as the developed world, produce technologies, and to a certain extent this is happening, right? The cost of solar power has plunged over the last, say, 2 decades, right? So that now putting up solar is the cheapest form of new energy. So if I'm adding capacity, it's the cheapest way to do it. So if you could make alternative forms of power just more desirable than fossil fuels, cheaper, more economical, then maybe you could coax the developing world. And if you had what is often called in these very complicated global agreements, technology transfers, there also should be probably a lot of money changing hands just to help out developing countries that will be disproportionately hurt by climate change, even though, as you say, they've contributed very, very little to the problem. And the US really needs to be, now this is the sort of my political analysis, which people can accept or reject, obviously. I would argue the US really needs to be at the forefront of that. We have been a pretty bad actor in the climate world. We have a new administration that's come in and vowed to be a good actor. And so we'll see what happens. I think the world is really yearning for American leadership on this, I think, because the problem simply cannot be solved without it.
I always wonder, like, ever since the 1830s, there's been books about how the world's going to be overpopulated in 10 years. And, in the 70s, there was a lot of worry, or early 70s, late 60s, there was a lot of worry about global cooling, which then became more about global warming. Now, given our technology and our scientific understanding of the planet has also gotten more sophisticated, so that could explain the fact that the world hasn't ended yet. I mean, I think it was in Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. He was basically saying by 1980, England would be starving. There wouldn't be enough food to feed the people in England. And of course, technology sort of adapts with the problems, as you point out in the book. But could it be that, all those predictions were wrong, but now we have enough understanding and when we're seeing with our own eyes the effects of it, that this is the real deal now?
You have asked the, $64 quadrillion question, and I do not have the answer for that. Doomsday predictions going back to Malthus, right, who argued in
Right.
the, late, when there were only around a billion people on the planet, that inevitably you had to have wars and famines to reduce the human population because there just was no way to increase agricultural production as fast as people were capable of increasing the human population. And then you had a lot of changes in the world, which included things like vaccines, and population, started to increase very, very dramatically. So in the course of my lifetime and your lifetime too, probably, human population has more than doubled. So that's a pretty short span of time to go through a doubling of the population. So as you say, you got predictions in the 60s and 70s that food production, once again, just couldn't keep up. And then we had the Green Revolution, and it did keep up. It managed to keep up, which was amazing for a doubling of the human population. And now we are facing again, our population is still increasing, not as fast, but we're facing the question, can we keep up just to feed the world? And then what are the other environmental side effects, the unintended consequences of that in terms of unraveling ecosystems potentially that we depend on, in terms of killing off other species? So all of these questions, and then you overlay climate change on top of that, which was not even on the horizon in the 60s, though it was definitely already being set in motion because we were burning a lot of fossil fuels, though once again, not nearly what we're burning today. So all these questions of whether we can sort of get through this moment, what the great naturalist E.O. Wilson has called the bottleneck, potentially this moment of maximum human impacts on the planet. Can we get through this century, as it were, with as much of the world intact, as many ecosystems, as many species intact as possible? That's sort of the question in front of us. And I don't have the answer to that, and I don't know that we'll make the right choice. I don't know that we'll make I don't know what choices we're going to make. No one can really tell you that. And you have to layer on top of that, we're not even exactly sure what the right choices are, but lots and lots and lots of very, very smart people are working on them. So that's, I suppose, the good news.
This is such a valuable service for all business owners, big businesses, small businesses, doesn't matter. I wish I had this in the many different businesses that I've started. Sometimes it seems like your business is humming, but then suddenly you don't understand it. You're starting to fall behind. You're not understanding where your costs are, where your revenues are, where your payments are. Teams are buried in all sorts of like BS work, and you can't seem to close the books. So you need like one dashboard, one source of truth. I'm jealous of this business, NetSuite from Oracle, of course, NetSuite by Oracle. I wish I'd come up with this idea. It's a brilliant concept to have all your business intelligence on one dashboard. This is why you need to know these three numbers: 37,000, 25, and 1. So 37,000, that's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the number one cloud financial system, streamlining accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind. So you get a customized solution for all of your key performance indicators, your KPIs, in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need to grow all in one place. So right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance absolutely free at netsuite.com/James. That's netsuite.com/James to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/James. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS
that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. I wonder if throughout history we've sort of gotten lucky because of technology also. Like, a great example is the big environmental problem in the 1890s in New York City was that horses would leave, a foot of shit all over the streets that would have to be removed every night. And people were predicting that New York City would be buried in shit by 1910. And of course, the invention of the automobile and the wide acceptance of cars, which ultimately led to the increase in carbon emissions. But the cars
Right.
solved our century, 130 years ago, environmental problem by luck almost. I wonder if we'll have similar luck somehow, that some new technology with some other use will end up being the magic elixir
Yeah.
that will save us.
Yeah. I honestly don't know. And so, the point of Under White Sky was to really go out and look at some really cutting edge technologies, and some technologies that aren't even technologies, yet, really, to be honest. They're ideas. So, for example, the last chapter of the book gets its title from this idea that, we've messed around with the atmosphere so significantly. We've poured so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we're warming the planet very significantly. What if we messed around with the stratosphere? What if we put some sort of reflective material in the stratosphere and bounce sunlight back to space? So we were basically reducing the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth, and then we could kind of even things out. So the warming would be counteracted, by this cooling. And volcanoes do that. That's what volcanoes do. They spew a lot of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and that produces a temporary cooling effect. So could we basically imitate volcanoes, but on a massive scale and more or less, I don't want to say forever, but for as long as we're emitting fossil fuels? How's that? And this is an idea that some people find absolutely radically insane, and that some people say, it's our best hope given what we've already done. And if managed properly, maybe could buy us some time to bring our emissions down and avert the worst effects of climate change. So there are a lot of, very smart people, as I said, and very dedicated people working on these ideas. Will they come and save us? That, once again, is a question I can't answer. If you, I guess, were a betting person, well, you'd say you could go either way. You'd say, yeah, we're here despite all of the predictions, and we're actually, aggregate on aggregate, and maybe until COVID hit, the world was doing better and better, even in terms of reducing very drastic poverty. But how many times can you play that trick? I guess we're determined to find out. How's that?
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And I was intrigued by one company you talk about, Climeworks, which you could basically trade off you could buy their ability to get rid of your carbon emissions, like whatever your carbon footprint is, they could have negative carbon emissions and suck those emissions out of the air and hide them. What about reusing carbon emissions? So, for instance, when a factory spews out carbon emissions, maybe you can funnel that back into the factory to provide a source of fuel.
Well, there are a lot of people working on that too, this idea of sort of recycling carbon. And the problem that you are facing, so I'll start with the story of what I did. I went to Iceland where Climeworks, as you point out, a company that's actually based in Switzerland, what they do is they have a machine. It looks like a big air conditioner, basically. It's sitting out in Iceland by a geothermal power plant, and they're actually, I just read, doing a big ramp up at this site. So they're going to put more of these air conditioner-like machines there. What these machines do is they take just the air that's flowing through. They have a chemical inside. The CO2 reacts with the chemical. It basically binds with the chemical. It's out of the air now. And then you heat it up and you drive off the CO2. You put it in a big bladder-like thing. And then at this site in Iceland, they pump it deep underground into this volcanic rock where it literally mineralizes. It turns into calcium carbonate. So this is what's called carbon dioxide removal. And there are all sorts of possible ways to do it. And one thing that you could do is at a power plant where, let's say, or at a manufacturing facility where the CO2 emissions are much higher than in the ambient air, you could take the CO2 out of the waste stream. It takes a lot of energy, but it certainly can be done. And then you would have to either dispose of it or, as you say, recycle it. You could maybe turn it into fuel, back into fuel. And the problem with that, the only problem with it, it's doable. Definitely, people would certainly tell you it's the chemistry is all there. It's just it takes energy at every step of the way. So why do that? Why not just maybe put up a solar panel instead? You have to question why go through all these steps and take all these energy. If you're producing that energy using fossil fuels, then you're just making the problem worse.
Unless you're able to suck out more than the energy it takes to produce it.
Right. Yes. So, efficiencies are incredibly important. And there are, definitely lots of, once again, very smart chemists working to try to improve that. But I mean, it's theoretically possible that you could get the losses down pretty low and that you could have a loop where you put CO2 into the air, take it out, make the fuel, use it again. And I think that will be a part of, what we do going forward, because there are things there are processes that it's very hard. It's very hard to see, for example, how you're going to keep airplanes in the air without fossil fuels. So you could argue you're going to need some way, if you're going to bring emissions to zero or to net zero, what's often called net zero. And what's built into net zero is, well, we're going to put some things up there, but then we're also going to take some CO2 out of the air. So whenever you hear net zero, you should realize that behind that is some plan to suck CO2 out of the air, because otherwise you don't get to net zero.
Yeah, I did not know until reading your book that carbon emissions were cumulative. That was a new thing for me. All these people you profiled in the book who are dedicating their lives to saving, let's say, some rare carp from extinction or some other species from extinction, what do you think these people have in common that they devote their lives to, essentially saving a particular species?
Well, I I met some, really wonderful people, and got to go to some great places. So, one place I got with the book was called Devil's Hole, which is a little canyon in the middle of the Mojave Desert, which is connected to this big underground aquifer. And at that particular spot, the aquifer sort of comes to the surface, and you get this beautiful pool of water in the middle of the Mojave at the bottom of this canyon. And there's the rarest fish in the world, which is known as the Devil's Hole pupfish, lives in this canyon. And back in the 60s, they started to pump water out of that aquifer, and it very, very nearly drove the Devil's Hole pupfish to extinction. But once again, here's a case of people stepping in to try to undo the damage that people have done. And so they stepped in. They have gone so far as to build a totally fake canyon. So there's one population of fish still in the real canyon, very small population. And then there's another population in a totally fake canyon, which is basically indoors. And there is a group of people from the National Wildlife Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who have kept these beautiful little fish. They're about an inch long. They're only about an inch long. They're very bright blue. They're very beautiful, alive. And they get, calls in the middle of the night. If some machinery malfunctions, they are completely dedicated to keeping this fish alive. And so far, I will give them credit, they have managed to do so. And I think that what unites all these people who are working on these projects is a real sense of commitment to leaving the world a better, or at least, let's put it this way, not worse place than we found it. And I am filled with admiration for all of them, really everyone I met in the process of reporting that book, I thought was doing something that he or she, one might question, is this the right thing to do? But they were doing it for the best motives, and genuinely hoping to make a difference.
And just out of curiosity, this is sort of unrelated, but is Devil's Hole the only place where these pupfish exist?
Yeah, the Devil's Hole pupfish is said to have the smallest, habitat of any fish in the world. Somehow this fish, it's a bit of a mystery. Somehow a fish, ended up sort of marooned in one pool in the middle of the Mojave, and no one knows exactly when or how it got there, but it evolved to become its own species, and it's a very distinctive species because it lost somewhere in this evolutionary process. There are many species of these little pupfish, which are so named because when they sort of tussle, they remind people of puppies. The Devil's Hole pupfish lost what are known as its pelvic fins. So you can tell immediately if a fish is a Devil's Hole pupfish because it doesn't have these fins. And it evolved under really tough circumstances. It is very warm. The water is very warm. It's heated geothermally. It's like 93 degrees. And it has very low oxygen. And most fish would not survive. They would just, croak right away. But the Devil's Hole pupfish has evolved to live under these very tough circumstances, and interestingly enough, only under those tough circumstances. So in the fake Devil's Hole, they keep the water at the same temperature. They keep the oxygen very low because that is what the fish has evolved to survive in.
And what do they eat?
They eat tiny little creatures, tiny little shrimp, tiny little algae. Their food is basically heading towards the microscopic, and they actually get supplemental feeding even in the real habitat, the real Devil's Hole, to help them survive because they're so close to the edge of extinction.
How deep is the Devil's Hole water?
Well, no one knows. That's a really interesting point. As I say, it's connected to this aquifer. People have gone down as far as 500 feet and not found the bottom. And in fact, in a sort of tragic side story here, some divers went down in the 60s. 3 divers went down. 2 of them never came back, and their bodies have never been found. So they're down there somewhere.
Wow. So, that could be part of the answer to how the pupfish got there, is perhaps this is connected up to, some primal area of the ocean.
Well, that's an interesting theory. I think people think that they could not have come from underground because that would be just too tough for a fish. But, nothing's impossible. And as I say, the sort of theory, the working theory is that at some point the area was wetter, at some point the fish washed in, and they got marooned there as if on an island. But no one is sure of that.
You know, I always appreciate books like yours, which are looking for solutions, not just for all these species from going extinct, but the overriding message is, humans are in danger of going extinct if these things happen over the next century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, however long it takes. But, and this is not really the point of your book, but what makes humans so special that we should care if we're extinct or not? Like tens of thousands of species go
Yeah.
extinct every year. One of these years, it's going to be humans.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I'll say to that. I wrote a whole book called The Sixth Extinction, and the question that always got asked after that is, how can we prevent humans from going extinct? And one of my conclusions after having, written the book was, well, of all the species that are likely to be able to survive with humans, humans are up near the top of the list because we are setting the rules here. Now, we could do something so stupid, that it would undermine, as I say, all these systems that we depend on. But there's almost 8 billion people on the world alive today. And to go extinct, you got to get to, 0. So that's a lot of people you'd have to do in. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's not my major worry right now. How's that? Now, I think there are many, 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 many thousands of species that are going to go extinct, before we will. But your more profound question, should we care? We're humans. Many of us have children and hope to have grandchildren and like to imagine a world of humanity moving forward. We're very attached, to ourselves. We always think of ourselves as special, deservedly or undeservedly as a species. But definitely the grand message of the history of life on Earth is that everything will go extinct eventually. Yes, Homo sapiens, there's no reason to believe that Homo sapiens won't eventually go extinct. Now, a species should have a lifetime of, let's say around 1 million years. So, if we're only 200,000 or 300,000 years into it, we should be able to last another several 100,000 years if we don't muck it up.
Well, Elizabeth Kolbert, Pulitzer Prize winner of the book The Sixth Extinction, and now you have a new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, and that future includes this almost partnership between humans and many of the species almost on the verge of extinction because of all these changes in the climate. Plus, the book is about all the technologies and man-made manipulations to now help what previously technology had caused. And it's a fascinating look at the people involved in saving all these species and the new technologies that we should look towards. Great book. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and explaining all these things to me. Sorry if any of my questions were naive or simple, but I'm learning.
No bad questions, as they say, yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.